Hello, Tom, aka Gerion here for Tabletop Tap Room. And today we're going to be talking about violence in RPGs. There's just recently a social media controversy that popped up. Somebody on Twitter talked about, and I'll just show you the quote here. I'm just going to say, I'm not going to reveal the person's name. The RPG pundit did a response video to this guy. I felt it was very well reasoned, and I'm not going to retread Carl's video at all. I want to actually speak to different points that were not really covered per se in the RPG pundit's video, but I will put a link to his video in the show notes if you're interested. So here's the quote that kicked it all off. D&D gives you the ability to do violence and no justification for that violence, so that the entire game is about characters seeking out violence to justify their own violence or simply accept their status as murderers. While we're on the quote, let's just point out that when it says the entire game is about characters, okay, so let's point out that there's a difference between the characters and the players. About characters seeking out their violence to justify their own violence. This phrase here, to justify their own violence, is in reference to the players, or simply accept their status, the players, as murderers. Unless the original tweeter massively messed up how he should have structured that statement. There's the only way to interpret that is that these two final theirs are referring to the players, that the players of RPGs are murderers. And this is an interesting concept. Now, as I said, RPG Pundit adequately responded to this, and we're not going to go there per se. We're going to look at this idea of violence within RPGs. Now, concerning this Twitter user, I just want to say I'm not going to reveal his identity, and I don't want to pump any oxygen onto the fire because he was kind of a nobody, and he's getting some attention through this really extreme, ludicrous, this really extreme point. So, don't go harass him. If you really need to go see his post, you can figure it out who he is from RPG Pundit's coverage of him. Now, RPGs are only really a matter of scale. You have one player controlling one entity, one character. And RPGs, as is well known, came out of wargaming. And in wargaming, you would have a general who's controlling battalions. So he's controlling figures, and each of those figures represent hundreds, if not thousands, of men on the game. And of course, there's that's mass battle wargaming, and then you've got the next scale down, which is called skirmish wargaming, where you're controlling figures. One player is controlling figures, and the figures represent maybe 10 men. And eventually you get down to the scale of role-playing games where it's a 1-to-1 ratio. And yes, I know that some skirmish games would have, say, 20 figures broken up into 4 squads, and each of those individual figures would represent one man, but that's the level of gaming. So if this concept of this violence, if it's accepted as true, it applies to all levels of wargaming and RPG. You have to apply it logically to all levels of wargaming. And if we apply it to wargaming, you also have to apply it to games like Risk, Axis and Allies, board games, that the violence being done, even though it's more abstract in a board game, that it applies to all of that. So it applies pretty much, logically speaking, if you start drawing this out, it kind of applies to like almost all forms of conflict in gaming. And then what is the difference between conflict in, say, theater, stories, novels? It's this idea of you're indulging and taking entertainment and enjoying a good action adventure novel, and there's violence in it. So this idea that conflict is bad, and I mean, it with board games, you apply it to even stratego, chess, checkers. There's conflict there, and it represents violence, and it represents abstractly. It represents people. So therefore, you would have to apply this to all forms of conflict, to stories you watch on TV, to theater you watch. If you go to the theater, going to the movie, all forms of conflict would therefore fall under this. If you began to parse it out, so then all forms of conflict are violence, and therefore, if you engage in that, you have a status of a murderer. I'm not advocating. Let me just be clear. It when you begin to logically parse it out, it starts to become silly. I mean, are we going to remake our whole society to wipe out all forms of violence in stories, all forms of conflict? No, it's not going to happen, because stories become vastly uninteresting without some form of conflict going on. If you go into that guy's Twitter feed, the responses, will fall into two camps of a little bit of fawning, like, oh, geez, yeah, yes, oh, this is great. And then the other extreme of, fine, you don't like D&D, go play Uno. Now, the underlying assumption here is that there is no justification for the violence being done in an RPG, which is a big assumption. And you know what they say about assumptions? You make an ass out of you and me. A lot of RPG modules are predicated on the village is looking to hire adventurers to go deal with the boule that is destroying their fields and killing the farmers. Is that unjustified? There's a justification there. And is it murder if you're just killing an animal? Like a boule is not something I would judge to be, a sapient being. It's not evil. It's not good. It's just a creature that's doing what it's like a marauding lion. It's the lion's got a taste for human flesh. It's killing villagers, and the hunter's got to go out and kill it. So there are justifications in RPGs, and it's not just about every RPG campaign is just to indulge in murder hoboing. So let's just talk about murder hoboing. And I recently did an interview with Tim Kask, and in there, he called himself a murder hobo. Let's review that clip.
Kill shit and take their stuff, or kill things and take their shit. And it was a variation on that, but it was essentially the same thing. We were all murder hobos back then. We were.
I was going to say, you sound a little bit like a murder hobo. Mm-hmm. I joked with Tim, you sound like a murder hobo. Actually, I think this term murder hobo has been used too frequently and applied too broadly. And I think in truth, adventurers going out, killing a bunch of stuff and taking their treasure, not necessarily murder hoboing. It can get applied to that, but it's more a murder hobo is where you're literally killing everything in the game. You walk into the town and I kill the blacksmith and just take the sword that I want. And, the town guard comes to object and I just kill them. It's killing everything in game with impunity and no consequences. That would be murder hoboing. If you're going into the caves of chaos on keep on the borderlands and you're killing the kobolds and you're killing the goblins and you're killing the orcs, there may be a thin justification there or no justification. I tend to set it up as, when I play the game as game master, I write in a little more justification, and I'm like, party's being hired to go in and search for somebody who's missing, who's been kidnapped. And so I write in a more so you're there looking to rescue someone. and the forces that oppose you from rescuing them are going to fight you. There's a fight going to go on there, and it's because they're on one side. And all of those caves, all of those tribes where you have sapient, intelligent, thinking beings, they're all in alignment with that shrine of evil in that last cave. So they're all supporting the cause of chaos and evil. So they've aligned themselves with evil, and the player characters are technically, even though they might be hired mercenaries, the force of good. They're there to oppose that. They're there to rescue someone. They're there to perform some action. And so I write in more justification. But even if you just play the module without any creativity, adding any justification to it, it's still, there's a justification implied in that these are the forces that have aligned themselves with evil. They've aligned themselves with the shrine. They're looking to take down all civilization. Whether the player characters are there, just they've been hired to go find the wand of fireballs, for a magic user that's lost, it's believed it's in the caves. Whether they're just, hey, we're looking for treasure, we're just looking for something to do. There still is just a very thin one in the module, and many modules actually have better justifications written into them. So this idea, this assumption that all D&D games are unjustified violence and therefore murder. Therefore, the players are indulging and have the status of murder. It just does not hold water. And murder is a legal concept. I mean, when you kill another person, we call that murder. But if I, when I worked in plumbing and we were installing a hot water heater that worked on gas and we improperly installed it and the house blew up and somebody died, I would not necessarily be charged with murder. I'd be charged with manslaughter. Guilty of manslaughter, there'd be a consequence for that. So murder is very much a legal term. And just because you perform violence, say putting down a rogue creature like a marauding lion, killing villagers, or boule, or even that look, these orcs are coming to raid the village and we're killing them. That's not necessarily murder. That's just, hey, we're defending the village. You have a right to defend yourself. We have self-defense. So this argument that violence in RPGs gives you the status of a murderer, it's kind of ludicrous, especially when you start to parse it out and say, look, if it's true of RPGs, it's true of all wargaming. If it's true of wargaming, it's true of board games. Because violence is conflict, and even if it's abstracted, and so then all conflict, therefore, must be bad. It doesn't hold water. This idea that we want to make all gaming bad, you're indulging in violence, you're indulging in conflict, therefore you have the status of a murderer. And by the way, the person who stated this seems to be an avid D&D player. So I guess he's, by his own standard, he's a murderer too. Let's get him charged and brought into court. I don't know. This idea, conflict is important. There's justification for violence. If somebody's trying to kill you, well, how do you know they're trying to kill you? Well, you'd only really know is after they actually killed you. So the standard is you're afraid for yourself, you defend you're afraid for your life, you defend yourself. And the standards vary state to state, but you're justified in using violence to defend yourself, to defend your family, defend your property, in many cases. So this idea that just playing in a game where there is inherent conflict is murder is kind of ludicrous. And it's the kind of thing that you got to go, no, that's silly, because if you apply it to all the logically to all that it would apply to, it just starts to become silly. So we're going to get rid of all games, including chess, Stratego, checkers. Because if you play chess, you're indulging in murder. You have the status of a murderer, according to the original poster. That's just silly. It's just silly. And I think RPG Pundit hit it well when he diagnosed that this person was a communist. As I watched the video, I thought, oh, geez, yeah, he diagnosed that well. Until I went to the guy's Twitter feed, and it's obvious this guy's a communist. So this idea that you should feel bad for engaging in any form of conflict. Conflict's actually good in some circumstances. The conflict going on in Ukraine, from the perspective of the Ukrainians, is good. They're resisting evil. They're resisting an invader that's coming in, and this invader doesn't care. Will target a school where civilians are hiding. From that perspective, it's good. From the perspective of the other side, not so good. Unless you're Putin. So violence and conflict are a part of RPGs. They're written into the DNA of RPGs coming out of wargaming. It can't be helped, but it does not give players of RPGs the status of a murderer. That is very much a legal term. And there are no laws saying if you kill an orc in an RPG, it's you're going to get 3 to 5 with time off for good behavior because you've murdered that orc. You've not murdered an entity. It's make believe. It's no one has been murdered. You do not have the status of a murderer. And I thank you for watching. I want to thank my subscribers. You guys are great. There'll be some notes in the show notes, some chapter headings. Just scroll down and keep on gaming.